This is the Germans from Russia Experience, Episode 9, The Rube Brothers, with descendant Ken Rube. Welcome to the Germans from Russia Experience. I am the creator and your host, Alisa Rodriguez, and I am here to inspire you and others to learn anything and everything about your own family heritage by providing information, experiences, and stories about a special group of people, the Germans from Russia. Hello, everyone. Today, I will be sharing with you a conversation that I had with Ken Rube. He is a descendant of the Rube family who left Germany in 1759 and made their way to the Volga by 1764. Several generations of Rubes produced this group of 7 brothers who each chose to serve their country in the United States military. Here is their story. Well, good morning, Ken. Thank you so much for being here with me today to talk about your father and his brothers and a very interesting family story.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You got something you want me to ask about or
Well, let's go
talk
ahead and
about?
just kind of start at the beginning about where your origins of your family came
Yes.
from, and then we'll get into the Ruby brothers.
We actually started in Württemberg, Germany, back in 1700. The next group of folks was John Frederick Ruby. Uh, he was the first to actually immigrate along with his family. They moved to Denmark. The King of Denmark had done something similar to what Catherine the Great had done, which is invited Germans to come and plow the lands and make increase the incomes of the people in Denmark. So they were called potato Germans because that's what they basically grew. But after 1760, some things didn't work out exactly right. And many of the potato Germans decided that they weren't too happy there. Maybe it was the swampland that they were trying to cultivate, and maybe
Yeah,
something there wasn't right.
yeah,
Not exactly sure.
I heard that the soil became really bad really quickly.
Uh-huh.
And that was one of the reasons they just really couldn't grow what they needed to grow.
And unlike a lot of the other Germans who came afterwards, they actually left out of Fredericia, Denmark, and arrived in Russia. And John Johann Friedrich, actually died in Denmark. And his son, which was Johann Adam Ruby, what became the family head, they landed in Schilling, Russia. And shortly after that, they moved to Laoway, Russia. And that's where primarily the family, including most of the relatives, have come from, is Laoway. So a lot of things were going on in Russia. You had the leadership changes, assassinations. You had political upheavals with the Bolsheviks and the communists, and things were not going so well. Plus, the way things were being managed down there, there were a lot of times when there were starvations. In 1887, it appears that there was a group of Volga Russians, German Russians, who sent a group to the United States and Canada to figure out whether there was other places to immigrate. Our group didn't show up until 1912. And by that time, we already had one son, which was my eldest uncle, which is John.
Okay, so that's your grandparents who came in 1912.
That's right.
Yeah, they
Mhm.
left Russia with one son.
And their first place was Lincoln, Nebraska. So, like a lot of German Russians that wound up in the United States, they primarily funneled through Lincoln.
Yes.
And there were other places. Some of them actually went through Canada because it looked like places that they knew, flat lands, arid kind of things. Strangely enough, it's kind of a odd thing we might get into in just a second. But Rube, R-U-B-E, is German for sugar beet.
Right. I saw that. That's really cool.
So guess where they wound up in about 1924? They wound up in Rocky Ford, Colorado, picking sugar beets.
Right, right.
So kind of crazy how that works.
Mhm.
After that time, they moved to Fresno, and they wound there about 1927 and started farming. They leased a farm across the street, and and then they were purchasing a farm, which was the 40 acres that I knew is where I grew up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how the short version of how we got here.
Yeah,
There
yeah.
are there are a lot of people who were named the same names. Johann Gottlieb Ruby. There was about seven of those. So it's like which Johann Gottlieb again?
Yeah, we all have that for sure.
Uh-huh.
Doing our research. So they came to Fresno, they started farming
Mhm.
grapes, correct?
Well, that was what was on the farm, but there were other things that they farmed: peaches, apricots. They had pomegranates as well. I remember that they had asparagus, and across the street were strawberries. So they were into all of that stuff. And during that particular period of time, they hired themselves out. So they were picking fruits and other crops all over uh, California. So one of the pictures that I have of my grandfather was that he was picking fruit in Armona.
Mm.
So they had to supplement their income somehow. It was kind of a weird time, of course, because being an immigrant from Russia, a German immigrant from Russia, no less, they weren't. They were on the Russian side of town. The Russian side of town was supposed to be the where the dirty people lived.
Yeah, same, very
But there
same.
is a story that my Uncle Pete told. He said one day he was along a railroad track that divided the Russian town from the other part, and a car stopped, and a guy asked him, "Where am I? Because I don't know, I don't recognize this place." He says, "Well, you're in Russian town." He says, "Well, I can't believe it. It's too clean to be Russian town."
Ah,
And it's kind of like the misinformation that you get from
yes,
your news sometimes.
yes, for sure. Mm.
So that's kind of how that worked. But I think there was some type of, because they had been so long in a place where they really didn't own the land there. Every so often, the land had to change over, and because of the number of males that were born, they had to make the plots smaller, or
Right,
they had
right.
to move on to other colonies, and that's where they kind of wound up. Is that my grandfather was listed as a laborer? He didn't actually own anything.
Hmm.
So for him to prosper, he needed to go somewhere where he could own something.
Yes.
And that's how they wound up in Fresno.
Mm-hmm. So between the late 19 teens and
Mhm.
the late 1930s, there were 10 Ruby children born. Is that
There
correct?
were actually 11,
11.
but one
Okay.
of them passed away. That was Lydia. She was born um, in Colorado, Rocky Ford, Colorado.
Okay.
And it was during the time that they were doing the beet harvest.
Hmm.
And my father wrote an article in the American Historical Society journal about the time. And he remembers that his mother was crying because it was such hard work. And while grandfather uh, uh, hauled the product, all these sugar beets in a wagon to where it was dumped and put in boxcars and sent somewhere, she was actually out with the children, and while she was pregnant. And she lost that child. It was born in February and died in March.
Mm.
I think it was 1928.
Okay.
So, yeah, that was not uncommon, but it is part of the story. So there was more than 10.
Okay.
Anyway,
Well, okay, so we're in Fresno in the mid 30s, late 30s, and the boys are coming of age, the seven
yeah,
brothers that we're going to talk about. And a couple of them looks like decide to join the military before 1940, so even before World War II begins.
that's
Uh,
true.
And then tell me what you know about your grandmother, who actually passed away in 1940. So even before the war, before her children
Right.
went off to war.
She passed away on January 24th, 1940. Uh, what had happened was she had hurt herself. She'd injured her ankle, and grandfather, who was part of an organization called the Brotherhood, had a meeting in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and he left with my oldest uncle uh, to go to that meeting. And while they were there, grandmother apparently had some issues with that injury. She wound up in the hospital. Now, what it shows in the death certificate was is kind of like a pneumonia, but what probably happened was there was a blood clot that passed to her heart, and that's basically what did her in. Of course, the family called my uncle, who got a hold of Grandpa, and they immediately rushed back, and they were there just a day or so before she passed away.
Hmm.
That was kind of tragic. The whole family um, was pretty much devastated from that. All the boys and the girls really loved my grandmother. Of course, I never knew her because I was born then, but you can tell from the pictures of the funeral that they were completely devastated.
Now she was
Um,
probably in her 40s, right? I didn't.
she was born in 1887.
Oh, okay.
So let's see, that would have
She was
been
53.
53. Yeah,
Yeah.
she was still a young kid
Mhm.
by our standards.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, Shortly after that, the Brotherhood had this deal that, or actually, it's German. It's kind of a German custom, I suppose, that if you have children at home, they tried to match you with a widow or a widower, so that someone would be there to take care of the kids. So Grandpa remarried, and none of the children liked her. Um, I don't want to go into details on that, but that was even my grandfather had second thoughts
Yeah.
there
Yeah.
towards the end.
Well, just from a quick glance, it appears they were all teenagers by then, at least, right? At least
Well, they
teenagers.
were all teenagers by the 1930s. My dad was born, would have been 16 in the 30s. Uncle John would have been 19, so he was the oldest. So
How
yeah,
long? The
they were
youngest?
all there.
The youngest was how old when mom died?
The youngest would have been Aunt Emma. She would have been 2 years old in
Oh, so there was a
1930.
baby still.
Yeah,
Oh.
she was still a baby. Oh yeah. And in 1940, when grandma passed away, she would have been 12.
Hmm.
So yeah, that was losing your mom at that age,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
devastating.
Yeah, sure, for sure. So it says here that each of these seven Ruby brothers decided to protect their family and their country. And before Pearl Harbor even happened, the bombing in Pearl Harbor in 1941, December, four of the seven brothers had already enlisted in the
That's
service.
correct.
Yes.
Yes.
And those would be, looks like,
Looks
um,
like John,
okay, the oldest.
Scott,
Uh-huh.
my dad Conrad,
Hmm.
and his brother Henry
Hmm.
all had enlisted prior to 1941.
Okay.
Um,
Yes, John.
Part of it,
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure that they necessarily did that because they understood that war was coming, although my grandparents talked about that period of time where uh, they were listening to the radio and they knew that something was going to happen. Um, but whether or not the kids decided that they needed to join because of that, it's kind of a different issue because at that time, you have a farm. Nobody really wants to work on the farm. I didn't want to work on the farm. Um, but they needed to have additional sources of income because every mouth that you were feeding cost money.
Yeah.
And I think what they did was they found that joining the National Guard was a good way to earn additional money, so that the family would be okay. And eventually they moved off, and that's how they supported their family with other things as well. But the
Yeah.
National Guard helped them, and that was a good thing.
I'm also thinking that the family dynamics with the stepmom, if that was a difficult situation,
Yeah.
that going away for a while that may have been one of the reasons that they also decided to
And
go.
and and that would have been true. She didn't show up in the picture until about 1942. So some of these,
Oh, okay.
so they were not, you know, they were had already enlisted when grandmother passed away.
Okay. All right. Interesting. Okay, so I'm looking down the list of these brothers here, and I see, of course, John was the first at age 27,
Mhm.
Army National Guard.
Right.
That was in 1938. And then most of the others, well, four of them looks like Army, all Army, which was
Well, they
kind
were all
of, isn't
Army.
that the main branch? Oh, yeah, yeah. And oh, there's three National Guards then here. Yeah. And then three
Right.
regular Army. So,
And it was all Army. In our family, there was only one person who was in the Navy, and that was my Aunt Mary's husband, Dick. And he enlisted in 1939. No, sorry, 1937 in the Navy. And he had an unfortunate incident. They were out on a training cruise, and he was up at a crow's nest, and he fell out of the crow's nest onto the deck, and all of his guts popped out.
ooh.
Yeah. So he was medically released in 1938, and then went on to marry my aunt.
Oh, so they put him back together.
Well, yeah, that was a good thing, I guess.
Wow. Wow. So do you have any stories that you know about the time that these men served in the military that
There were
there?
a lot of stories. Let's go to two of the uncles, which was my uncle John and my uncle Henry. Uh, they were assigned into the Pacific Theater, and my uncle John was in the aviation part. He was in what do they call that? The Army Air Corps, and he was in the 931st Engineering Aviation Regiment. And what they did was they confiscated airfields after the enemy was kicked out, and then they brought in their Army aircraft, and that's he was a supply guy, so he made sure that the Army aircraft were taken care of and supplied. But my uncle Henry, he was in an anti-tank group, which was a military, sorry, an artillery organization. So he got to get flights as an artillery spotter in aircraft. Well, where would you think he would go? Well, they have to go somewhere where they're going to fix the things, and that's where he met several times with my uncle John. So
Oh, okay.
even while they were overseas, they were able to make connections with each other.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, if
Yeah,
brothers actually served together at the same time on the same.
in the same theater, but never in the same place. Um, my dad served basically in the headquarters detachment. So while he had a lot of things, he everybody had to be a rifleman, everybody had to be a marksman, everybody had to do. He called himself the armchair infantry, where since he was in the headquarters, he didn't actually see any combat like Uncle Henry or my Uncle Bill saw. But nonetheless, he had several stories about the headquarters calling up, and it was General MacArthur on the line. Whoa! And General MacArthur says, "Well, how many people are in your unit?" And he not only told them all the names, but he told them all their serial numbers. So he was really proud of that. And I guess you should be. I mean, I think probably of all the things, all the guys who went to war, the one who collected all the information and had to know who was dead, who was wounded, that would take a toll on you. And it did to him for some time. So, those were people that he knew. Those are people that he had to take care of and track of. And
Mm-hmm.
yet, so anyway, that was his job. He was armchair infantry, he said. Let's go back to Uncle Henry. Uncle Henry, he kind of did a lot of weird things that the normal military, the normal army wouldn't have done. So when he was assigned to the uh, anti-tank group, he decided that he was watching the men go through the manual of arms, open up the breech, do this, do that. Well, he said, that takes a long time. We got to get bullets in the air, and we can't sit around here kind of looking at each other. Well, what do I do next? So he actually uh, created a faster way of shooting that anti-tank gun. And it was so impressive, apparently, that he was promoted out of the enlisted ranks into the officer ranks. And then he moved all the way up through the chain and eventually became lieutenant colonel. And that was a temporary lieutenant colonel, so it wasn't a permanent rank. But the fact that he moved up that far was absolutely amazing, especially at a time when the military wanted you to do this. And he decided, maybe it would be better if we did that.
Mm-hmm.
Military is weird.
Yeah, I don't know a lot about the military, so I'm interested in more that you have to say.
Um, let's see, who else? Oh, probably the one who was my uncle Scott. Uh, his name is Gottlieb. But of
Yes.
course, like all the Germans, they didn't want to be noted as Germans when they were in fact in war with the Germans.
Right.
So he went by the moniker Scott. He was a first lieutenant in the 80th Infantry, and he was deployed to Normandy about 2 days after the Normandy invasion of D-Day. His unit saw a lot of combat. He talks about in some of his journals where they were caught in sniper fire and machine gun fire, and how some in one particular instance when they were trying to cross a river, and I guess one of his younger enlisted folks got panicked, and he was telling everybody, stay down, stay down. Well, this kid stood up and he got shot in the head.
Mm.
So yeah, so those are the things that he remembers. Some of that stuff turns out to be like the PTSD stuff, you know.
Sure.
Anyway, he crossed into Germany. He on the last day of the battle, uh, I never understood why the military, especially the army, does these things. But on the last day of the battle, they were told, you need to go as far as you can. You're going to get as much land as you can before the armistice goes into effect at 11 o'clock.
Mm.
Well, so that's what he did. And, there was a meeting just before they were supposed to push off. And his captain at the time, Captain Edward Leroy, mentioned to all of the folks there that he wasn't, that I hope that they were successful, that he wasn't going to be able to make it. Well, everybody said, this is the end of the war. Of course you're going to make it. Well, unfortunately, I guess, uh, my uncle and several others went out and did their thing. They pushed forward. They overcome some machine gun nests. And when the armistice occurred, they all came back to the headquarters, and his commanding colonel was there. And he says, "Well, I guess you're in charge now." He says, "I'm in charge. I'm the first lieutenant. I'm not in charge. The captain's in charge." No, the captain was shot by a sniper. And here's the binoculars with that he was shot through one of the lenses.
Wow.
And so you're in charge now. And he gave him his weapon and the binoculars.
So they already
Um,
knew that the war was going to end in the next several hours.
and they were told to go in.
Ahead and they went ahead and continued instead of just sit there. I would have just
Yeah.
sat there and waited for, it to come, the time to pass, but they pushed through and then you said the captain was
Was
killed.
killed.
Wow.
He prophesized his own death. It's like I don't know what goes in the minds of folks, and I don't know why they had to go press forward when knowing that the timeline was already out.
Right,
But
right.
that's apparently what the Army does.
Mm.
Uh, or maybe it's the politicians that make the Army do that. I don't know. Maybe it was to redefine the lines between you and whoever's going to be the people on the other side. Don't know.
Yeah. Well, hopefully
So
policies have changed on that.
he was the
Terrible.
the oral tradition was that he was up for the Medal of Honor, but somehow the paperwork got lost. So the highest that he received was the Distinguished Service Cross,
Mm.
which obviously he deserved.
Mhm. Now he was also wounded as well, right?
He was wounded several times, and he was assigned. The way the Army worked is that units went in and out of different commands. Like the Third Army wasn't always 100% the Third Army because when they needed some additional help, units were reassigned. His unit was reassigned to the Third Army, and he talked to General Patton several times. One of the things that he did while he was in the Third Army was he interrogated German prisoners. And there were some people who would beat the prisoners up to get whatever information they could. He was not that kind of guy, but he still got the information that he needed. Some of the times, the German prisoners would pull out their photographs of their family and their children, and Uncle Scott would do the same thing. So they had a common ground. It wasn't like, you're the bad guy. We're both guys trying to survive.
Yeah, he
And what do
understood
you know?
the
So
humanity of it, sure.
that's right. So um, he was a fairly private guy. The only time that I know that he spoke about this was one of my cousins asked him to speak at his school, and he volunteered to go and speak at the school. Otherwise, he spoke mainly to my oldest uncle John, and they didn't talk about very much with the rest of the family. It's like I don't know that they would understand, kind of thing. The when you have seen the things that they saw,
Mhm.
maybe that's what happened. They were only 2 years apart, but similar experiences, I think.
Yeah. Now, were any of the other brothers injured, wounded in war?
None that I'm aware of.
Okay.
My uncle Pete could have been wounded. My
Mm.
uncle Pete was involved in the invasion of Sicily, and
Oh,
he started out at Fort Hamilton in New York. And of course, the invasion of Sicily was one of the first, I guess, blows or the first big battles trying to get into Southern Europe. Now, he was on a ship, a landing craft, and they were deploying all of their forces out of that ship. What happened next was the German Air Force decided that they were going to come and try to strafe everybody and blow everything up as much as they could, and that was their job. But apparently, there was one aircraft that was going to strafe his ship, but ran out of bullets. So Uncle Pete says he was looking at this guy, thinking he was going to get shredded by all this cannon fire, and instead, the guy saluted him as he flew past and went away. And
Wow.
that's kind of one of those scenes that you would only think would be in a movie somewhere, but
Sure.
that actually happened to him.
Wow.
He was also involved in the invasion of Anzio, which wasn't the smartest thing in the world, but we did. And then later he was assigned to Marseille, France. Now, Uncle Pete probably never knew this, but he was directing traffic for all of this military equipment through the canals in Marseille. All those that military traffic, all that stuff that was on these little boats, was going to support an operation called Operation Dragoon, which was actually the southern invasion of Italy. I mean, southern invasion of Europe and France. And that's what kept a lot of the Germans from trying to get into Normandy to block the folks that were coming in on D-Day. Because now they got a two-front war. They got this operation down south in France, and then who's going to be monitoring the northern part of France? And that was one of the reasons why D-Day was as successful as it was because the Germans were occupied looking another direction, which is what my Uncle Pete did.
Yeah. Wow.
But who knew? I mean, you're the toad. All you see is trucks go this way and that way, or barges going this way and that way, and you don't know what's happening. I mean, the only guys who knew what was happening was the guys who had the big picture, and he was only the left-hand corner of that picture.
Wow. Interesting. Now, one of these brothers, William Ruby, was my eighth grade history teacher.
Oh, Uncle Bill.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was an amazing guy. Um, he was a perfectionist woodworker, for example. But the fact that here's a lowly guy from Russian Germans coming to, living on the Russian side of town, which was supposed to be the dirty side of town, and he makes it all the way to be uh, a teacher at Fresno City College. Who would have known that?
Yeah, he taught me at Cooper Middle School for eighth
Oh, he
grade.
did? Yeah.
Eighth grade
Oh,
Constitution. I learned the Constitution.
oh.
Yeah.
See, who says us dirty Germans were?
I remember him being very tall and
Yes, he was very tall.
handsome, even though he was, he wasn't a young man at that time. I think he was close to retiring. This was like 1980,
Yes.
81. So yeah, I just remember him being very tall and he taught me the Constitution. So that was great.
Well,
Okay.
Uncle Bill, he was another one that was in violent combat.
Oh. Mm.
Um, he was actually sent to the Philippines, and there's an island off the Philippines called Zamboanga, and the Japanese didn't want Zamboanga to fall, so he was sent in there with the 41st Infantry Division, and they fought. Actually, he's one of the two uh, brothers who actually got a medal for actually um, this an invasion by beach landings. So he landed on the beach. He talked about the battles, and in a sense, you can tell from the way he described it how intense it was. But there was also kind of a gallows humor. He talked about during the battle, one of the guys in his unit was actually blown up and out into the air,
Wow.
and he was saying that, yeah, that was kind of funny how he flew out into the air. Now, normally you and I would say that's terrible, that's
Sure.
horrible, But that's the kind of gallows humor he had to survive.
Yes. Yeah. Read about that.
And so that battle, obviously, the United States came out ahead on that battle. They killed more Japanese than were killed on our side. But his claim to fame was that he was reassigned to the occupation of Japan. And while he was there, he got sick and he was in the hospital. So he could actually see from his hospital room where he was supposed to be at the guard shack uh, when General MacArthur came through. He says he missed his chance.
Oh,
Missed General MacArthur coming through the guard shack he was supposed to be at.
wow.
So it's kind of funny the things that you think about, in the situation. Now, we talked a little bit about PTSD. Here's one of the things that happened. My Uncle Pete and my Uncle Bill lived really close to each other. And on occasion, they would get together and with the kids, my cousins, and they would watch TV. Well, it's one particular time they were watching TV and there was a war movie or there was a war thing like 20th Century or Victory at Sea. And there was a battle that was going on. And all of a sudden, Uncle Bill got up and ran out. And they went out to find him. And he was hiding behind a shed in the backyard.
Hmm.
And he was just scared to death.
Yeah.
And it was that PTSD thing.
Hmm.
So a lot of them did their wartime experiences in different ways. Sometimes they ran out in the backyard. Sometimes they wouldn't talk.
Hmm.
They only answered questions if you asked them a question like you're asking me.
Yeah.
So that was the fact that he was able to do the things that he did after seeing the battles that he saw
Mhm.
is an amazing thing just by itself.
Okay, so can you tell me about what the sisters were doing while all their brothers were off at war?
Well, uh, my my Aunt Anne was the one who everyone sent their money to, and she was supposed to take care of the family with that money. But what she did was she saved it all. So when the boys came back, they had all their paychecks, and it was pretty amazing to them to know that their sister had taken care of them like that. Now, my grandfather, who previously had done that for the boys, he would have used that money and, because they would have sent it to him to be used. But she took a different approach. She was living with relatives in town at the time for a whole nother story that we won't get into here. But they really appreciated my Aunt Anne. But she wasn't married at the time. She was working. My Aunt Mary, she was married to my uncle um, Dick, who was the guy who fell out of the crow's nest.
Right.
And so they were kind of doing their own thing. And my Aunt Emma was too young to be doing anything other than being at home on the farm.
Hmm.
So that's kind of how the rest of the family went. There was only one other brother left we didn't talk about, and that was Uncle Dave. But um, the girls did their share. I mean, it wasn't like um, the boys are gone, so we're just going to sit around and well, you can't watch TV. They didn't have any, but you know what I mean.
Yeah,
Sitting doing the bonbon thing or out lounging around, they were expected to work,
sure.
and so that's what they did. They were no different than any of the other kids on the farm. So yeah, the the extended family. Now, my Aunt Annie eventually married a guy named August Sinner. Now, Uncle August was also in the military, but he was mechanically inclined. And instead of going in the military per se, because of the technology or technical stuff that he knew, he was actually assigned to Chandler Field here in Fresno.
Mhm.
And he worked on a specific secret project called a P-70, which was called a Nighthawk. It was a night fighter, and it was a variation of the P-38 twin boom uh, fighter. And he was taught by Northrop and other companies how to do what he did. But all that to say that just because you went off to war didn't mean you weren't part of the war effort. The girls certainly weren't immune from the war effort. I mean, all of us, all of them had to worry about rations and taking care of things, but also doing their job at home. And so the boys did the same. Um, the My uncle Leo, who married my mom's sister, he was a technical sergeant. Now, a technical sergeant was an interesting thing. It wasn't actually a military rank. He was a technician because he knew how to do things like get supplies in. And eventually he was out on the rifle range teaching recruits how to shoot the rifles, but he was never technically in the military. It was a pay rank and not a military rank.
Yeah, I've only heard of this recently. I don't have a lot of people in my family that served at all, so I've never known that much about the military. But
Mhm.
there are jobs that civilians can do within, the military, and I've
Exactly.
recently heard of that. I never realized that before.
Well, it was a way to pay people. Uh, these days we would call them contractors.
Yes.
Blackwater, for example, who went into Iraq, those were military contractors. They were actually military members who had gotten out of the military and contracted themselves out to Blackwater to do things like escort services and security details and things like that. Um, for the State Department and others. So yeah, but that happened a long, long time ago.
So
So yeah,
all seven brothers returned from their
all
military.
seven brothers returned. Now let's talk about Uncle Dave just for a minute. He's the one that we left out.
He was
Uncle Dave,
the youngest of the boys.
he was the youngest of the boys, and he actually wound up going to what we now know as Fort Hood, Texas. But at that time, it was called Camp Hood. And he started out doing things like uh, a mechanic on a tank, for example. And he got to drive tanks. And these were experimental things that he was involved with. But eventually, in 1944, he registered for the draft. He was inducted in 1945 after the war was over.
Right.
The problem is that just because the war was over didn't mean hostilities were over.
Right.
And until the declaration of that was taken care of, so he was actually discharged in 1946, which was after the war, but he did serve in the Pacific Theater. So yeah, all seven of them went to war. They were in hostile areas, but they all returned, and that was the magic of the seven brothers. Seven brothers went, seven brothers came back.
Mhm.
As we know now, there were relatives who had sent eight brothers, and eight brothers came back.
Yes, yes.
But these are my brothers. These
Sure,
are
sure.
my uncles.
Your family. Yes, yes. Yeah. Well, Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to tell me the story of your father and his brothers and the family. I hope my listeners find it very interesting as I have, and thank you.
Well, thank you for even asking. Part of our history lies in remembering those who went before us, and they're not dead as long as you remember them. And I appreciate you even asking me. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Germans from Russia experience. I hope that something you heard today will inspire you to learn anything and everything you can about your ancestors. If you like what you heard, please leave a review, like, and share this podcast. You can comment directly by emailing me at thegermansfromrussiaexp@gmail.com.
Also, like my Facebook page, the Germans from Russia Experience podcast. There you will find photos of the Rube brothers. Please see my show notes for website suggestions to begin or continue your discovery of your Germans from Russia roots. My podcast artwork is by Matt Wall. My technical assistant is my friend Annie Anderson.